morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me for this discussion. And I've got with me today the three editors of a new urban history volume called The Modern British City. So I'm Krista Cowman, Professor of History at the University of Leicester. I'll let the three of you introduce yourselves and then I'll start off with the questions.
Well, I'm Simon Gunn I'm Emeritus Professor at the University of Leicester.
I'm Otto.
I'm Otto Saumarez Smith. I teach at the University of Warwick.
And I'm Peter Mandler from Cambridge.
Great. Okay, so just to start off then, what made you come up with the idea for this project? Why did you think it was a good time to do a book on the modern British city?
Well, I think, if I can just kick off here, the book in a way came out of a conference in 2014 held at Leicester that was called The Transformation of Urban Britain. And I co-organized that with Rebecca Magin. And a number of the contributors to the present volume actually presented at that conference. Guy Ortolano, Otto here, and
it was my first conference.
It was your first conference.
Yes, it was my
and
debut.
After it, you were very enthused by it, Otto, and I was very enthused by it. And we formed something called the Society for the Promotion of Urban Discussion, which was a network. And so gradually, over the next 4 or 5 years, various people came to the network, including Peter. And by about 2019 to 20, we thought we were catching a new kind of urban history wave, really, particularly with young scholars. I'll stop there because others might want to add something else to that.
Let me just sort of add a kind of meta analysis, because I wasn't in that originary moment. But I do think that one can say something about that historiographical wave. In the 1990s, I tried to write a book about the post-war British city, and I found that not only was no one else interested in it, but I wasn't interested in it either. It seemed to me that there was something really distinctive about the post-war British city that was partly, but not wholly, a function of the planning, the unusual planning structure that was set up. Also partly a function of new forms of architecture and new materials, but I couldn't find any way to write it except as a planning history, and it seemed really dull. And as I said, no one else was interested in it either. So I gave it up and started doing something else. And then, about 10 or 15 years later, you could see it starting to emerge as a subject. I think partly because a younger generation was further away from the sort of the post-war social democracy, able to be a little bit more objective about it. But also, didn't want to reduce it to a planning system, but could see it had social, economic, aesthetic, and other dimensions. So maybe that's your cue, Otto, because you're the younger generations.
Yeah, I mean, the third thing about where it comes from is our sort of inspiration of this moment of Victorian urban history, and feeling that was, which sort of culminated in many ways in the large volume, The Victorian City, edited by Dyas and Wolfe, and that was in many ways a model for what we wanted to do, of bringing together, I think, sort of different ranges. I like the way that goes from John Summerson on, architecture, all the way down to Raphael Samuel on tramps, and we wanted to capture something of that diversity in the contributions, which I think we've succeeded.
I should show it off, and also show you how thick it is. It's like Dyas and Wolfe. It's not 2 volumes, but it's like what is it, 36 contributions?
It's satisfyingly heavy as well.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you about that actually, and the connection with the Dyas and Wolfe volume, because obviously in in many ways it does sort of stand in that tradition. But is there anything that you think is particularly different about doing it now? I mean, obviously, the cities are different because it's 100 years after the Victorian period. But given somebody mentioned the eclecticism of the themes in the Dios and Wolf volume, do you think there's anything specifically different that just could not have been in that volume? Or do you think there's something that maybe was in that volume, but you couldn't possibly have had it in this volume for various reasons?
Well, we haven't. I think the inspiration of the Dios and Wolf volume was partly a negative one. We didn't want to do surveys. We didn't want to have surveys. We wanted to have original essays that might spark, rather like the Dios and Wolf volume did. It sparked ideas about how one might write different kinds of histories about British cities, and that's exactly what I hope that the present book actually does.
I mean, a conventional thing. I mean, obviously, as you say, Krista, it's 100 years later. The city is different, so there's a lot of things that are in this book which couldn't have been in the Victorian city. It's much more multicultural. It's actually, I think, moves around the British Isles much more extensively. But to give Dios and Wolf credit, and I think this is something that was, maybe this is partly what Simon was gesturing towards, something that's been lost since the 60s and 70s, is that it was a very interdisciplinary book. It was filled as much with literary scholars and art historians and just essayists as it was by mainline historians. And that's something that we wanted to recapture, because again, when I go back to thinking about why I couldn't write my book in the 90s, I was too stuck in a disciplinary moment, and we needed to break out of that and to bring in other modes of writing and other ways of approaching the world. And actually, I think the fact that Otto is, really an architectural historian and has therefore organically connections to other disciplines has helped a lot.
Otto, is there anything you'd like to add, or shall I?
Please go on.
Push on with another question. So, what are the main themes of the volume then, for people that haven't read it or been able to see the contents list yet?
Well, we followed to an extent the sort of headings, the broad headings of the Dios and Wolf volume. Again, sort of nodding towards that, but we also departed from those headings. So there's a section, for example, called Everyday Politics, which wasn't in the Dios volume. But there are, we have a section called Ideas in the Air, which is very much in the Dios and Wolf tradition of trying to think a bit about the kind of ideas that shape what the modern city might mean in the British context. Similarly, we have a section that looks at particular social groups. We look at working class community, we look at gentrification. So there are different sections to the book that take you through different kinds of ways of thinking about the city at the period. Otto,
and
do you?
I hope one of one of the sort of arguments in the introduction that I hope the book shows is the way that these different processes interlink and come across it, and I think the book is these themes are meant to intersect and talk across the book.
Yeah, and to use an older language, I think the book is equally devoted to and doesn't segregate structures and experiences. So there's stuff about planning structures and regulatory structures and economic structures and governing structures, but there's also lots of material about the experience of people living in, passing through, and experiencing cities in lots of ways, including as visitors or tourists, or people going out to dance or to eat and drink, but also, as I say, we've tried to mix these up so that you don't get that divide between structure and experience, which was sort of sometimes beset urban history, I think.
Yes, I think that's one of the things that really struck me when, when I just looked at the contents list, that although it is very much an urban history volume firmly in many, many traditions of urban history, it's also in a way much, much more than that, that at the experiential level, at the quotidian level, a lot of these things are happening, they're happening in cities, but it's about the things that are happening in the city rather than the city in which things are happening.
Yeah, well put. That's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, and I mean, you can see that both in I guess in Erica Hanna's chapter on Belfast, which is very much about the everyday experience of the Troubles, and she talks about queuing and waiting and all those kinds of experiences. As well as in, say, your chapter, Krista, on women's activism, or indeed Florence Sutcliffe Braithwaite's chapter on homelessness. The kind of everyday city is there, I think, in many, if not most, of the chapters.
Of course, one of the big problems facing a book like this, and it was really evident in Dias and Wolf, I think, as well, is the London problem. And one thing that we've tried to do is give London its due, because there is a great story to be told there, as there was for Dias and Wolf. I mean, they had the advantage of, having the shock cities of the north, but they didn't actually go that much beyond those two kinds of city, where in lots of different kinds of cities. And the Erica Hanna's chapter on Belfast that Simon mentioned is a good example, and Owen Hatherley's on Southampton. And actually, hat tip to Otto, because Otto has a hilarious and tragic chapter called Scrambled Cities, which is about cities that really never made sense again after their Victorian heights and got riddled by the experiences of the 20th century.
So
I think it's a theme in a lot of them, is that the Victorian cities still mattered in this period, and our cover, will you show us again, Peter, has this wonderful Peter Mitchell photograph which shows it has a Victorian terrace, and I think with this concrete modernist block behind it, and of course the concrete modernist block has been demolished, and the terrace street is still there. So, and I think this sort of suggests something about the sort of ephemerality of so much of the modern city, that it wasn't there for that long, and that the Victorian city still matters. I was, I think. Modern urban history in Britain is told through places which are defined by their newness. So it was important to have places which weren't. Not everywhere looks like the Barbican or Cumbernauld, or actually very few places do.
And I think it's a properly British volume as well. I think one of you mentioned that a little bit earlier, that you've tried very hard to get a wider spread than not just, obviously away from London, but also.
I regret not having Cardiff, but you can't have everything.
Okay, so I guess just a final one. There's so much in this book, and we've just touched on much of it very, very briefly, the different themes and different priorities. Do you think there's a takeaway for readers here as to where the subject of urban history in Britain might be going in the next 10 years?
Well, one thing I would take away, especially I guess if I was perish the thought, but a PhD student again, was actually in the final afterword that Peter's put together, provides you with a kind of new periodization, I think, of the period from 1945 through to the 2000s, and gives you a sense of a larger urban history that I certainly find really very useful. And one of the interesting points that Peter makes is how the period, in a sense, pivots not on the 1950s and 60s, as so much of the earlier planning history did, but now on the 70s and 80s, which is now becoming the turning point. So I think that's a really useful takeaway from this volume. It'll be interesting to see how that develops over the next 10, 20 years or so.
And of course, we also all want to find out what happens to the city in the 21st century, but we're historians. We're not very good at predicting the future.
Okay, before I stop the recording, is there anything that I've not touched on that you'd really like to share with people about the book?
Well, Krista, you're a contributor. I mean, what has been your experience of joining this team, and what do you think the book is contributing?
I think it has a lot to say to people who wouldn't normally consider themselves as urban historians, and I think that's quite an interesting thing, because I think that there was a period outside of sparing Simon's blushes, because he was very much within urban history, but there was a period, I think, in the 90s and the 2000s when it was quite difficult to get people to engage with the idea of urban history if they weren't absolutely central to it, that they saw
Exactly.
it as, as they saw it as planning and structures and quite boring.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really lively volume, and it has things in it that you just wouldn't consider as, well, if you were outside of the field, you wouldn't consider that this is actually where urban history is at. So I think that would be my main takeaway.
Music to our ears.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. That was great.
Thanks, Krista.
Thank you, Krista.
Thanks for the
Thank you,
opportunity.
Krista.